Is It Shame or Is It Water was a 2-day symposium organised by Katherine Collins, Helen Mort and Mariah Whelan in August 2021. We brought together poets, researcher poets and poet researchers interested in the intersections of their disciplines, and we explored the questions we, as members of this growing field of inquiry, should be asking of our practices, our ethics, our outputs, and ourselves. We began, as is fitting, with a poem of Helen's about the notion of research impact.
Thanks, Katie. Yes, we were talking about poetry that connects to the themes of the conference, and I said, it just so happens. So this is like, at the beginning of an open mic, you have sometimes the host does like a sacrificial poem, which always sounds quite macabre to me, but this is our sacrificial poem and discussion. So this is a piece I wrote a few years ago, just called Impact. You are a researcher. And right now, you are investigating a shaft of sunlight as it cuts across the pylons on Dark Lane, a botched shelf fallen from the sky, the course of a single frown line on your father's face, a raindrop down a window pane in Ullapool that turns into a vein in your first boyfriend's arm. Is your image prescient? Does it represent his persistent use of heroin, for example? For some time now, you've been researching the slant of your lover's collarbone, the exact scent of the near side of your child's neck. Is this universal? It depends. Consider the scene you always come to when you think of home, the velvet walls of Livingston's nightclub, the desk where you shivered through your shift and watched a man in a boater, suit and polished shoes, waltz around the dance floor with a cherry VK, stiff arm held out to leave room for someone not yet there, his chin tilted towards the ceiling fan, his stare a 1980s glitter ball. What precisely are you hoping to investigate? Is this a class issue, reprisal of your early themes? Have you been distracted by the ceiling fan again, slow blades that make you think of wind farms on the coast? You might develop this environmental metaphor. Alternatively, you could describe the times you glance at it when the stag do stragglers breathed WKD blue across your face, asked how you were getting home. The subtext isn't lost on us. Coalfield's regeneration commentary might be invaluable. When you write instead about the cold field of the bed you'd crawl into at 4 a.m. to wait for dawn above the woods, a stranger in your own small life, you should ask yourself what you are trying to achieve, whether your words are touching anyone except yourself.
That's amazing, Helen. Thank you. I'm just putting my reaction as a pair of hands clapping. And then each of us has written a short response to Helen's poem as a way of thinking through some of the questions that prompted us to convene this symposium and some of the questions we're interested, not necessarily in answering, but certainly exploring over the course of the sessions coming up for the rest of today and tomorrow. And so this is my response to Helen's poem. What is a researcher? Someone who generates new knowledge as a way to understand the world. What is a poet? A person who spends their time generating words, images, lines, and stanzas as a way of understanding experience. Where does this desire to understand begin? I think it begins in a state of wonder. The philosopher Howard Parsons likes this idea of wonder too. He defines it as the moment when a human being becomes aware of a gap in our systems of experience and meaning. The researcher, suddenly aware of rupture, this wound in the fabric of human knowing, is filled with the desire to repair it, to use their tools to refashion it with new knowledge, remaking our understanding into something that is more complete than it was before. Does poetry seek to mend? I read Helen's poem as an invitation to step into the wound. I am with the poem's researcher as, engaged in their investigation, in their close observation of a shaft of sunlight, experience begins to rupture. As the light cuts across the moment, the poem cuts down into a string of images, raindrops as tears, veins, cutting deeper and further back into memory. The words cleave. The poem does not seek to repair a wound as a means of understanding. The wound itself is the knowledge the poem offers us. If the knowledge a poem offers us is the wound, what does that do to questions? Helen's poem is framed by coy questions that assume the language of academia. I'm reminded of a review of Leah Silveris' Arabilis that states how, belying each poem, is a tenacious grasping for answers to questions impossible to express. What are the impossible questions at work in this poem behind its surface questioning? If poems are haunted by questions we can't form into language, what does that do to the idea of a research question, or the idea that poetry might help us answer those questions? What does poetry do to our idea of what research is? These are the kinds of questions I'm interested in over the next 2 days. But here I am again, already defaulting to the kinds of expressible questions that don't satisfy me. Perhaps I should have written a poem instead. Katie.
Thank you both. So the research I've tended to do has been very much about interacting with people and quite practical as well, practical interactions, which is odd when I think about it, as I'm actually much more comfortable as the poet in a room of researchers, encouraging my students to pay attention to the metaphors and images in their writing, to notice the sounds and rhythms of the words as well as the information they're intended to convey, as a way of reflecting on the relationship between writing and knowing. But in the context of the task Helen, Mariah and I set ourselves to read and respond to Helen's poem, keeping in mind the connection we're drawing here between poetry and research, I found myself world building, asking questions about the social process implied in the poem and its connection to the practice of research. I find myself reading Helen's poem as if it were data from a life story interview. So I visualise Helen and I in a cafe. I arrived first and sat at the quietest table I could find, furthest from the deafening hiss of the coffee machine. I've checked my digital recorder and checked it again. Helen has read the information sheet, she's signed the consent form, she doesn't have any further questions about my research. I ask her if it's okay to begin recording. Then I say, Helen, one of your early themes was class issues. Can you tell me about that? And she does. Later, I'm analysing a transcription of the recording. I'm working with text, though I can still hear Helen's voice in my mind. What do I notice as I code? Home is a nightclub, a specific one. It's cold there, and the walls are velvet. There's a man. His outfit is very distinctive, but he's distant. Formative relationships with men seem fraught. There's a father who frowns, a substance-abusing partner. 2 brands of drink are referenced, both brightly coloured, sparkling, with relatively low alcohol content, linked conceptually and via the images to the nightclub that represents home. These are the kinds of musings evoked by the word research. And this is, of course, almost the perfect example of exactly the wrong way to read a poem. But perhaps it does offer some insight into the question the poem settles on. Are your words touching anything other than yourself? It reveals to us, perhaps, the power that images have to connect the lives and experiences of one person with another, whether they reach us via a poet's imagination, as a result of careful, empathetic listening and observation by a researcher, or vice versa. And I think the conundrum presented by that vice versa is the point of the next 2 days' conversations, or at least it's where my area of interest lies. And Helen.
So I'm going to follow those beautiful and profound reflections on the theme of the conference with a tiny coda, which basically expresses my own difficulty with research, which is that. In my life as a writer, I'm a writer who works in an academic institution at Manchester Metropolitan. I'm also a researcher, but my problem is, I think, that I've always seen poetry as both the answer and the question. I feel like I can only really get close to saying what I mean by approaching it from the side, sort of sneaking up on it through metaphor or ambushing it with allegory, and then sometimes other people then are able to tell me what I meant in that, and so there's something in that I think explains my reluctance to unpick and explore poems after their writing and dissemination, my annoying tendency to present a poem last of all and just go there, nothing more to say, which was a real disadvantage through my PhD, which drew on my first degree in psychology and sociology, to explore connection making in poetry and neuroscience. And I was looking at the work of 3 writers, but I drove my supervisor mad because I just assumed that the value and meaning of each poem I quoted was obvious, irreducible, and unparaphrasable. So I had a tendency to sort of make an argument and then go, here's a poem. So I come to this symposium really curious to discover more about the research that can unfold around the poem and enfold the poem, and the idea of poems as research and poems in research and whether they're compatible. And as if to illustrate my point, I am going to finish by reading the poem again because we thought it'd be nice to hear something twice. So, as usual, my cop-out, let poetry have the last word, impact. You are a researcher, and right now you are investigating a shaft of sunlight as it cuts across the pylons on Dark Lane, a botched shelf fallen from the sky, the course of a single frown line on your father's face, a raindrop down a window pane in Ullapool that turns into a vein in your first boyfriend's arm. Is your image prescient? Does it represent his persistent use of heroin, for example? For some time now, you've been researching the slant of your lover's collarbone, the exact scent of the near side of your child's neck. Is this universal? It depends. Consider the scene you always come back to when you think of home, the velvet walls of Livingston's nightclub, the desk where you shivered through your shift and watched a man in a boater suit and polished shoes waltz round the dance floor with a cherry VK, stiff arm held out to leave room for someone not yet there, his chin tilted towards the ceiling fan, his stare a 1980s glitter ball. What precisely are you hoping to investigate? Is this a class issue, reprisal of your early themes? Have you been distracted by the ceiling fan again? Slow blades that make you think of wind farms on the coast? You might develop this environmental metaphor. Alternatively, you could describe the times you glance at it when the stag-do stragglers breathed WKD blue across your face, asked how you were getting home. The subtext isn't lost on us. Caulfield's regeneration commentary might be invaluable. When you write instead about the cold field of the bed you'd crawl into at 4 a.m. to wait for dawn above the woods, a stranger in your own small life, you should ask yourself what you are trying to achieve, whether your words are touching anyone except yourself.